The first glimmer of dawn was beginning to peek over the historic rooftops of the French Quarter when Detective Luc Benoit arrived at the latest crime scene. Weary from a long night of investigating, he ducked beneath the police tape and stepped into the dimly lit alleyway. His eyes were immediately drawn to the horrific sight before him. The body lay sprawled on the cobblestones, a grotesque tableau of blood and mutilated flesh. Luc grimaced, steeling himself as he knelt beside the victim, his experienced gaze cataloging the gruesome details. The man's torso had been savagely carved open, his organs spilled out in a macabre display. Deep gashes marked his limbs, the skin peeled back to reveal the underlying musculature. But it was the victim's face that truly unsettled Luc. The eyes had been gouged out, the mouth frozen in a silent scream. "Another one," Luc muttered, shaking his head grimly. This was the third such murder in as many weeks, each more disturbing than the last. The killings had shaken the usually vibrant French Quarter, leaving the locals on edge and the police force scrambling for answers. Luc rose to his feet, surveying the alley with a critical eye. There were no signs of a struggle, weapon evidence, or other clues that might provide a lead. Just the horrific remains of another victim, claimed by the ruthless killer that had been stalking the streets of New Orleans. As the forensics team began meticulous work, Luc stepped back, lost in thought. There was no doubt in his mind that these murders were connected, but what was the common thread? Was it random chance, or was there some more profound, more sinister purpose behind the killings? Luc's musings were interrupted by the arrival of a familiar face, Amélie Rousseau, a young woman he had encountered at the previous crime scene. Her delicate features were drawn with worry, and her green eyes shined with determination and trepidation. "Detective Benoit," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I'm so sorry. I know you must be overwhelmed, but I need your help." Luc regarded her with a guarded expression. "Miss Rousseau, what are you doing here?" Amélie took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "It's my grandmother, Madame Claudette. She's missing, and I fear the worst. I think these murders, they may be connected to her disappearance." Luc's brow furrowed. "Your grandmother? What makes you think that?" Amélie hesitated, her gaze darting around the alley as if she feared being overheard. "I know this may sound strange, but my family has deep ties to the voodoo community here in the French Quarter. Madame Claudette was a respected practitioner, and I can't help but feel that her disappearance is somehow linked to these ritual killings." Luc stifled a sigh. He had heard whispers of the city's voodoo underbelly. Still, he had always been a pragmatic man, more comfortable relying on cold, hard evidence than the mystical beliefs of the superstitious. Still, the desperation in Amélie's eyes gave him pause. "All right, Miss Rousseau," he said, his voice measured. "Tell me what you know." Amélie's shoulders sagged with relief, and she quickly launched into her explanation. 3 nights ago, Madame Claudette called me, sounding terrified. She said she had uncovered something terrible that threatened our entire community. She begged me to come to her home, but the line went dead before I could. When I arrived at her apartment the next morning, it was ransacked, and she was gone. Luc listened intently, his mind racing. "And you believe these murders are connected to her disappearance?" Amélie nodded, her expression grave. "I can't shake the feeling that they are. The way the victims have been mutilated has all the hallmarks of a voodoo ritual gone wrong. And Madame Claudette, she was always so careful, so cautious. For her to have disappeared like this, it has to mean something terrible has happened." Luc considered her words, his skepticism warring with his growing unease. "Miss Rousseau, I understand your concern, but you must understand how this sounds. Voodoo rituals and mystical disappearances? That's not exactly the evidence I can bring to my superiors." Amélie's eyes widened, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, detective, you have to at least look into it. Madame Claudette is all the family I have left, and I can't bear the thought of her being in danger. If these murders are connected to her disappearance, then we may be able to stop this killer before he strikes again." Luc hesitated, his gaze drifting back to the gruesome crime scene. As much as he wanted to dismiss Amelie's claims as the ravings of a worried, superstitious young woman, there was something in her eyes, a profound fear and conviction that gave him pause. "All right, Miss Rousseau," he said finally. "I'll look into it, but I make no promises. If there's even a shred of evidence that your grandmother's disappearance is linked to these murders, then I'll follow up on it. But you have to understand, I'm a detective, not an expert in the occult." Amelie's face lit up with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Detective Benoit. I know this is a lot to ask, but I can't do this alone. I have to find my grandmother, and if these killings are somehow connected to her disappearance, then we need to stop this madness before it's too late." Luke nodded, his expression grim. "Then let's get to work. The sooner we figure out what's going on, the better." As Amelie followed him away from the crime scene, Luke couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had taken root in the pit of his stomach. There was something deeply unsettling about this case, something that went beyond the gruesome nature of the murders. And if Amelie's suspicions proved true, they were facing a threat far more sinister than any ordinary killer. Luke steeled himself, his resolve hardening. He might not believe in the supernatural, but he would be damned if he let this twisted murderer claim another innocent life. With Amelie as his unlikely ally, he would uncover the truth, no matter how dark and disturbing it might be. The Maison Dupree, a mystical shop located at the heart of the vibrant and bustling French Quarter of New Orleans, was managed by the towering figure of Jacques Dupree. Jacques was known for his piercing eyes that seemed to penetrate one's very soul, his deep knowledge of voodoo, and his intimidating presence. The shop served as a sanctuary where he offered guidance and protection to those who were drawn to the mystical arts. One night, the shop was eerily lit with flickering candles that cast long shadows and the glow from various voodoo totems. Jacques had been haunted by a mysterious force for weeks, and the whispers grew louder and unbearable tonight. He could no longer ignore it. Kneeling at the ancient altar, he started chanting, calling upon the Loa, the spirits of the voodoo pantheon. The room pulsed with energy, and the air thickened with a potent, invisible force, accompanied by the scent of incense that filled his nostrils. Suddenly, an evil presence breached his sanctum. Fear gripped Jacques as the candles flared wildly, casting grotesque shadows, and a heavy dread filled the room. Dark tendrils of unseen energy wrapped around him, cold and invasive, penetrating his essence. He cried out, his will overwhelmed, his consciousness consumed by this evil force. The spirits he had always communed with now turned on him, their forms twisting from benevolent guides to monstrous figures, their howls piercing the air like the cries of the damned. Jacques struggled in vain as the entity took hold, reshaping him into its sinister instrument. He watched helplessly as the last vestiges of his humanity were swallowed by darkness. Jacques stood transformed when the tumult subsided, and the candles dimmed to mere flickers. He was now a vessel for something profoundly evil. Gone was the respected Voodoo Priest, replaced by a conduit of malevolence. A sinister smile spread across his lips as he surveyed his sanctum. With a casual flick of his wrist, talismans and fetishes crashed to the ground, their shattering echoing ominously.
"Time to get to work,"
he murmured, his voice echoing with a dark, otherworldly timbre. He stepped out into the lively streets of the French Quarter, blending into the night. Armed with unholy power and evil intent, Jacques was poised to unleash a reign of terror that would irrevocably change the spirit of New Orleans. As he vanished into the shadows, the French Quarter remained oblivious to the horror that now walked among them, a horror born from one of their own. The humid air of the French Quarter hung heavy with an undercurrent of unease as Amélie Rousseau navigated the winding streets, her footsteps quickening with each passing moment. She had come to this shadowy underworld once before, a lifetime ago. However, the memories of that time still haunted her, the acrid scent of burning candles, the ominous chanting, the unseen forces that seemed to lurk in every shadow. As she approached the weathered facade of the Maison Dupree, Amélie felt a familiar dread in the pit of her stomach. This was where her grandmother, the revered Madame Claudette, had once come to seek counsel and perform her rituals. It was also, Amélie suspected, the very place where her beloved abuela had met her demise. Steeling herself, Amélie pushed open the door, the familiar chime of the bell cutting through the oppressive silence. The shop's interior was dimly lit, with shelves lining the walls and cluttered with exotic trinkets, talismans, and jars filled with mysterious contents. Amélie's gaze swept the room, searching for any sign of the man who presided over this mystical domain, Jacques Dupree, the Voodoo Priest whose name had become whispered with a mix of reverence and fear throughout the quarter. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing faintly. "Is anyone here?" A muffled thud from the back of the shop drew her attention, and Amélie cautiously made her way toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. Pushing open a heavy curtain, she found herself in a dimly lit room, the air heavy with the scent of incense and the unsettling atmosphere of a sacred space. Kneeling before an ornate altar was a figure shrouded in shadow, his deep, resonant voice chanting in a language Amélie recognized as Creole. She hesitated, uncertain whether to interrupt the ritual. Still, something compelled her to step forward, to confront the man who might hold the key to unraveling the mystery surrounding her grandmother's disappearance. "Jacques Dupree," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to speak with you." The chanting abruptly ceased, and the figure turned to face her, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. Amélie felt a shiver run down her spine as she took in the man's imposing presence, the weight of his gaze seeming to bore into her soul. "Amélie Rousseau," Jacques said, his voice rich and resonant. "I've been expecting you." Amélie's brow furrowed in confusion. "You were expecting me? How did you—" Jacques raised a hand, silencing her. "I have my ways, child. The Loa have been whispering, warning me of your arrival." Amélie swallowed hard, her mind racing. "The Loa? You mean the voodoo spirits?" She took a step closer, her gaze narrowing. "What do you know about my grandmother's disappearance?" Jacques regarded her with an unreadable expression. "Ah, Madame Claudette, such a remarkable woman, so in tune with the ways of the Loa. It is, indeed, a tragedy that she has been taken from us." Amélie felt a surge of anger, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "What do you mean, taken from us? Do you know something about what happened to her?" The Voodoo Priest let out a slow, measured breath. "I sense your desperation, child, your fear for the one you love. But I must caution you. The forces at work here are beyond your comprehension. Madame Claudette's disappearance is but a small piece of a much darker puzzle." Amélie took another step forward, her eyes narrowing. "Then tell me, Jacques, what do you know? I need to find my grandmother, and if these murders are somehow connected to her, then I have to stop them. Please, you have to help me." Jacques hesitated, then warned her, "This may shatter your understanding." Amélie nodded, bracing herself. "I'm listening." Jacques rose and explained the dangers of the voodoo world. There are powerful evil spirits that feed on the pain of mortals. These spirits have come to our city, seeking a vessel to carry out their horrific plans. Amélie felt a chill run down her spine, her mind reeling. "You mean, do you think one of these spirits has possessed someone? Is that what happened to my grandmother?" Jacques nodded solemnly. "I believe so, yes. Madame Claudette was on the verge of uncovering the truth, of stopping the entity's plans. But in doing so, she has become its latest victim." Amélie felt her knees go weak and steadied herself against the altar's edge. Then, these murders, the way the victims have been mutilated, that's all part of some voodoo ritual?" "Yes, child," Jacques said, his voice laced with a somber gravity. "The entity has ensnared a vessel, a human host through which it can manifest its dark power. And it is using this vessel to commit these atrocities, to strengthen its hold on our city." Amélie's mind whirled, her thoughts racing. "But who? Who is this vessel? This person that the spirit has possessed?" Jacques fixed her with a piercing gaze. "That, Amélie Rousseau, is the question we must answer before the entity's plans come to fruition and all of New Orleans falls under its sway." Amelie felt a surge of determination, her fear and grief giving way to a steely resolve. Then I'll find them. I'll find the one the spirit has possessed, and I'll stop them no matter what it takes, for my grandmother and this city's sake. Jacques inclined his head, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. You are indeed your grandmother's granddaughter, child. But be warned, the path ahead will be fraught with peril. The entity you seek to confront is ancient, and its power is beyond mortal comprehension. Amelie squared her shoulders, her gaze unwavering. I don't care, I have to try. My grandmother needs me, and I won't let her down. Not again. Jacques held her gaze for a moment, then turned and reached into a nearby alcove, retrieving a small, intricately carved wooden box. Then take this, he said, handing it to her. It is a talisman imbued with the protective power of the Loa. It may aid you in your quest. Amelie accepted the box, her fingers tracing the intricate designs. Thank you, Jacques. I don't know what I'm getting myself into, but I must try. Then go, child, Jacques replied, his voice almost imperceptibly tinged with, was it concern? Time is of the essence. Find the one the entity has claimed and stop its dark plans before they come to fruition. With a resolute nod, Amelie turned and hurried out of the Maison Dupree, the weight of the talisman in her hand a tangible reminder of the arduous journey ahead. As she stepped out into the streets of the French Quarter, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, the unseen forces of the voodoo world closing in around her. But Amelie refused to be deterred. She would uncover the truth for her grandmother's sake and the city she loved, no matter the cost. In the French Quarter, we had always hummed with otherworldly energy, a vibrant tapestry of music, revelry, and the lingering scent of incense and spices. But on this night, that tapestry was unraveling, the threads of normalcy fraying under the strain of a dark, supernatural force. Jacques Dupree stood in the shadowed alcoves of the Maison Dupree, arms outstretched, his deep voice resonating through the dim confines of his inner sanctum. The air crackled with unseen power, the candles flickering wildly as the Voodoo Priest summoned the Loa, the spirits and deities of the Voodoo pantheon. Amelie Rousseau watched in awe and trepidation, the small wooden talisman clutched tightly in her trembling hands. She had come to Jacques in search of answers, and now she was entangled in a web of ancient, evil forces that threatened to consume her. As Jacques' chanting reached a crescendo, the very foundations of the building seemed to tremble, and Amelie felt a surge of primal fear. Something was happening, something far beyond her comprehension. Suddenly, the air erupted in a cacophony of unearthly screeches, and Amelie whirled around to find herself face to face with a horde of nightmarish figures. Contorted, skeletal forms coalesced from the shadows, their glowing red eyes fixed upon her with predatory intensity. Amelie let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward as the voodoo spirits advanced. She had heard the stories, the whispers of the dark entities that lurked in the margins of the voodoo world, but to see them manifest so vividly before her eyes was a horror beyond her imagining. "Jacques!" she yelled, her voice shrill with panic. "What have you done?" The Voodoo Priest turned to her, his expression twisting into a cruel smile. "I have summoned the Loa to do my bidding, child," he said, his voice layered with a sinister resonance. "For the entity that has possessed me demands a terrible sacrifice, and the spirits will be the instrument of its will." Amelie's blood ran cold as she realized the implications of his words. This was no mere possession. Jacques Dupree had willingly given himself over to the entity, embracing the dark power that now coursed through him. "But why?" she cried, her desperation clawing at her throat. "Why would you do this?" Jacques' smile widened, his eyes gleaming with unholy hunger. "Because the power it offers is beyond mortal comprehension. With the Loa at my command, I will remake this city in the entity's image, and none shall stand against me." Amelie felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the voodoo spirits surged forward, their unearthly howls echoing through the sanctum. She knew she had to act and find a way to stop this madness before it consumed everything she held dear. Clutching the talisman tightly, Amelie called upon the protective power Jacques had imbued it with, praying that it would be enough to shield her from the spirit's onslaught. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she stepped forward, her gaze fixed upon Jacques. "This isn't you, Jacques," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "The man I knew, the one my grandmother respected, he would never have betrayed his community, his people, to serve some demonic entity." Jacques' expression darkened, his features contorted with rage and contempt. "You know nothing, child," he spat. "The entity has shown me the true nature of power, the limitless potential within the voodoo arts. Your precious community will bow before me, or they will be destroyed." Amélie shook her head, her eyes pleading. "Please, Jacques, you have to fight this. Think of my grandmother and all the people you've sworn to protect. Don't let this evil consume you." For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty passed across Jacques' face, and Amélie dared to hope that she had reached him, that some vestige of the man she had known remained. But then the shadows seemed to deepen, and an evil force radiated from the Voodoo Priest, pushing Amélie back with a tangible wave of energy. "It's too late for that, girl," Jacques growled, his voice guttural and inhuman. "The entity has chosen me as its vessel, and I will not be denied. Now, my children, go forth and spread the darkness." With a wave of his hand, Jacques unleashed the voodoo spirits, the nightmarish entities surging forward in a tidal wave of skeletal limbs and glowing eyes. Amélie braced herself, the talisman held before her like a shield, as the spirits descended upon her. The air crackled with an unearthly energy, and Amélie felt the very air being sucked from her lungs as the spirits closed in. Their talons raked at her flesh, their eerie wails piercing her ears, and for a moment, she feared that the talisman's power would not be enough to protect her. But then, from the shadows, a new presence emerged. A towering figure clad in the robes of a Catholic priest, his face etched with a grim determination. Father Dominic, the man Amélie had encountered at the previous crime scene, raised his hand, his voice ringing with a resonant authority. "Begone, foul spirits," he commanded, the air shimmering with a sudden surge of sacred energy. "In the name of the Lord, I banish you from this place." The voodoo spirits recoiled, their unearthly cries morphing into shrieks of pain and terror as the holy power washed over them. Amélie watched in awe as the spectral forms dissolved, their essence torn asunder by the priest's fervent exorcism. Jacques Dupree let out a guttural roar of rage, his eyes burning with unholy fury. "Blasphemer!" he howled, his hands lashing out with a burst of dark energy. "You dare to interfere with the will of the entity?" Father Dominic braced himself, his expression unwavering. "I will not stand idly by while you unleash this evil upon the city, Jacques Dupree. Your dark pact ends here." Amélie watched as the priest and the voodoo priest fought with arcane power for the fate of the French Quarter. As the conflict persisted, Amélie couldn't just watch Father Dominic carry the burden alone. The city's safety and her grandmother's fate were at stake. Amélie gripped the talisman and charged into the fray to stop Jacques Dupree and the entity controlling him. The battle for the French Quarter had just begun. Amélie held the talisman tightly as she watched Father Dominic confront Jacques Dupree. The air was thick with energy. Two men fought fiercely with supernatural forces. Father Dominic invoked his faith to exorcise the evil spirit possessing Jacques. "In the name of the Lord, I command you to release your hold on this man," the priest bellowed, his voice resonating with a righteous authority that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the Maison Dupree. Jacques raged and attacked with dark energy. The shadows coiled around Father Dominic, threatening to suffocate him. Amélie watched in horror. "You foolish man," Jacques snarled, his voice layered with the sinister resonance of the entity that had possessed him. "The power of your God holds no sway over the entity I have sworn to serve. This body, this vessel, is ours now." Amélie watched as Father Dominic faltered and the sacred energy flickered under the voodoo priest's dark power. She couldn't stand by and watch, not when so much was at stake. Amélie held up the talisman and pleaded with Jacques. "Fight this! The entity is corrupting you. Break free!" Jacques sneered at her. "The little Rousseau girl. Do you really think your pleas will sway me? The entity has shown me true power, and I won't be denied." Jacques ensnared Amélie with a dark tendril, constricting her movements and causing her to drop the talisman. Father Dominic's expression, etched with renewed determination, said, "Amélie, hold on." His voice was laced with urgency. Bracing himself, Father Dominic began to chant in Greek, the words rolling off his tongue with a rhythmic cadence. As he spoke, the air around them thrummed with a palpable energy. Jacques recoiled, his features twisted in a mask of pain and fury. "What is this?" he growled, the tendrils of darkness that bound Amélie beginning to unravel. "An ancient rite of exorcism," Father Dominic replied, his voice steady and unwavering. "One that has the power to cast out the most malevolent spirits." Amélie watched as Jacques convulsed and writhed, seemingly possessed. "No!" the Voodoo Priest howled, his hands clawing at his head as if trying to tear the entity from his very being. "I will not be denied. The power is mine." Father Dominic chanted while Amélie watched in awe as the shadows retreated from the sacred energy of the priest and voodoo artifact. "Fight it, Jacques!" Amélie cried, her voice laced with a desperate plea. "I know you're still in there fighting to break free. Don't let the entity win." Jacques briefly recognized Amélie's words, but then the darkness took over and he screamed loudly, sending shivers down her spine. "Impossible!" the entity-possessed Jacques roared, his body twisting and contorting as if in the throes of a violent exorcism. "My hold on this vessel is absolute. I will not be cast out." Father Dominic's chanting reached a crescendo. Amélie shielded her eyes, the air crackling with an overwhelming energy that seemed to permeate every fiber of her being. Thunder cracked and shook Maison Dupré. Amélie fell to her knees and then found Jacques motionless on the floor. Amélie feared the exorcism had killed the Voodoo Priest, but saw his chest rise and fall, bringing relief tinged with uncertainty. Father Dominic approached Jacques' prone form, his expression inscrutable. Kneeling beside the Voodoo Priest, he placed a hand on his forehead, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The entity has been expelled," the priest said solemnly, "but its hold on Jacques Dupré was strong, and the process has left him in a fragile state." Amélie felt relief that the evil spirit was gone, but also pity for the man who had once been a community pillar. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Father Dominic rose to his feet, his gaze sweeping the room. "Now, we must confront the true extent of the entity's plans. This was a single battle in a much larger war, and I fear the worst is yet to come." Amélie shuddered as the priest spoke. She knew the fight wasn't over. The entity that possessed Jacques was just the beginning of the darkness they had to face. Looking at the unconscious Voodoo Priest, she felt determined. She had come this far, faced the unimaginable, and was still standing. She couldn't turn back now. Her grandmother's fate and the city's safety hung in the balance. Amélie looked at Father Dominic and said, "We must act fast. Let's find out the entity's plan and stop it." The priest nodded in admiration. "Let's uncover the darkness that threatens this city and end its reign of terror." Together, they stepped out into the night, the weight of the talisman a tangible reminder of the battle they had just endured and the even more significant challenges that lay ahead. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness as Jacques Dupré, the once respected Voodoo Priest, knelt before the ornate altar in the inner sanctum of the Maison Dupré. His eyes were closed, his lips moving in a steady, rhythmic chant reverberating through the dimly lit chamber, stirring the shadows that clung to the walls. Amélie Rousseau watched from the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. She had witnessed firsthand the entity's power, how it had relentlessly clawed its way into Jacques' mind and body, transforming him into a vessel for pure evil. And now, it seemed, the entity was preparing to unleash an even more significant, devastating force upon the unsuspecting city of New Orleans. Beside Amélie, Father Dominic stood with his brow furrowed in concentration, his fingers grasping the voodoo talisman that had helped banish the entity's hold on Jacques during their previous confrontation. Amélie could see the gears turning in the priest's mind, as he no doubt weighed the risks and consequences of intervening once more. "We have to stop him," Amélie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Whatever ritual he's performing will give the entity even more power. We have to act before it's too late." Father Dominic's gaze shifted to her, his expression grave. "I know, child. But we must be cautious. The entity's hold on Jacques is stronger than we anticipated, and we cannot afford to underestimate its power or its cunning. Amelie's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles turning white with the force of her grip. "I can't just stand by and watch," she hissed. "Not when my grandmother's life is at stake and the entire city is in danger." The priest placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "I understand your urgency, Amelie, but we must approach this with care and wisdom, lest we find ourselves outmatched once more." Amelie opened her mouth to protest, but a sudden shift in the atmosphere stilled her words. The air crackled with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Something was happening, something profoundly unsettling. As Jacques' chanting reached a crescendo, the candles flickered and danced, their flames casting an eerie glow over the Voodoo Priest's features. Amelie watched, transfixed, as he reached into a nearby alcove and retrieved a small, intricately carved wooden box, its surface adorned with intricate voodoo symbols. "What is he doing?" Amelie breathed, her voice tinged with dread and morbid curiosity. Father Dominic's grip on the talisman tightened, his knuckles turning white. "He's performing a ritual that will likely strengthen the entity's hold on him and this city. We must be ready to intervene, but we must also be cautious. The Loa will be summoned, and their power should not be underestimated." Jacques opened the wooden box as the priest spoke, revealing a collection of small, arcane objects. Amelie watched, her heart pounding, as the Voodoo Priest began to carefully arrange the items on the altar, his movements deliberate and precise. The air grew thick with the scent of burning incense, the pungent aroma mingling with the musty smell of the ancient texts and talismans surrounding them. Amelie felt a sense of unease creeping up her spine, a foreboding feeling that the very fabric of reality was beginning to shift and warp around them. Jacques' chanting grew more impassioned, the words tumbling from his lips with a staccato rhythm that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the Maison Dupree. Amelie could feel the energy building, a tangible force that seemed to press against her, suffocating and overwhelming. Suddenly, the candles flickered and guttered, plunging the room into near darkness. Amelie felt Father Dominic's grip tighten on her arm, his breath catching in his throat. "Be on your guard," he whispered, his voice laced with dread. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, and Amelie felt a chill run down her spine as she realized it was the sound of laughter. A deep, guttural chuckle that seemed to emanate from every corner of the room. "The entity approaches," Father Dominic murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "We must be ready." As the laughter grew louder, Amelie watched in horror as shadowy figures coalesced around the altar, their forms shifting and writhing in the flickering candlelight. She recognized them as the voodoo spirits the Loa Jacques had summoned during their previous confrontation, but their presence felt darker and more evil this time. The spirits surged forward, their skeletal limbs reaching out towards Amelie and Father Dominic, their glowing red eyes fixed upon them with predatory intensity. Amelie felt a surge of panic, her muscles tensing as she prepared to fight back. But before the spirits could close in, Father Dominic raised the crucifix. "Begone, foul entities," he commanded, his voice resonating with a power reverberating. The Loa recoiled, their unearthly howls echoing through the chamber as the sacred energy of the talisman washed over them. Amelie watched, her eyes wide with awe, as the spirits seemed to dissolve, their essence torn apart by the priest's unwavering faith. Jacques' expression was twisted with rage and desperation, and he continued chanting, his voice rising in volume and intensity. Amelie could see the sweat beading on his brow, the strain of his efforts etched into every line of his face. "The entity grows stronger," Father Dominic growled, tightening his grip on the crucifix. "We must stop him before the ritual is complete." Amelie nodded, her determination hardening. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. The priest's gaze met hers, a flicker of pride and admiration crossing his features. "We must disrupt the ritual, break his concentration. If we can do that, we may be able to weaken the entity's hold on him." Amelie took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation. "Let's do it, for my grandmother and the city we love." With a nod, Father Dominic turned his attention back to Jacques, his lips moving in a steady, rhythmic chant as he channeled the power of his faith. Amélie watched, her heart pounding, as the two men engaged in a battle of wills, the air crackling with the intensity of their clash. As the ritual reached its climax, Amélie knew that the fate of New Orleans hung in the balance. She could feel the darkness closing in, the entity's malevolent presence threatening to consume them all. But she refused to back down, her resolve hardening with every moment. Amélie stepped forward with a deep, steadying breath, her voice joining Father Dominic's in a chorus of defiance. Together, they would confront the darkness that had taken hold of the city, and they would not rest until the entity's grip was broken and the French Quarter was safe once more. The French Quarter had always been a vibrant, pulsing heart of New Orleans, a tapestry of music, revelry, and the lingering scent of spices. But on this night, that tapestry was unraveling, the threads of normalcy fraying under the strain of a dark, supernatural force. Amélie Rousseau and Father Dominic stood their ground as the shadows deepened, the air growing thick with an oppressive energy. Jacques Dupree, the once respected Voodoo Priest, had become a vessel for an evil entity, a being of pure darkness that sought to consume the city and all who called it home. The ritual Jacques had been performing was reaching its climax, and Amélie could feel the very foundations of the Maison Dupree trembling under the strain of the arcane power that swirled around them. Beside her, Father Dominic, his lips moving in a steadfast chant to banish the encroaching spirits. "We must disrupt the ritual," the priest growled, his voice edged with urgency. "If we can break Jacques' concentration, it may weaken the entity's hold on him." Amélie nodded, her mind racing as she searched for a way to intervene. She couldn't afford to be reckless, not when the fate of her beloved city and the memory of her dear grandmother hung in the balance. But she knew that they were running out of time, that the entity's grasp was tightening with each passing moment. Steeling her resolve, Amélie stepped forward, her gaze locked on Jacques' face, etched with an expression of twisted ecstasy. "Jacques," she called out, her voice cutting through the cacophony of chanting and unearthly howls. "This isn't you. You have to fight it. Fight the entity that has possessed you." The Voodoo Priest's eyes snapped open, and for a fleeting moment, Amélie saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze. But then the darkness surged back, and Jacques let out a guttural roar, his hands lashing out with a burst of dark energy. Amélie barely had time to react as the evil spirits materialized and surged towards her, their icy coils wrapping around her limbs, constricting her movement. She let out a strangled cry, her heart pounding in her chest as the entity's power threatened to overwhelm her. But before the darkness could claim her, Father Dominic stepped forward, holding the crucifix high. "Begone, foul spirit," he commanded, his voice resonating with righteous authority. "In the name of the Lord, I banish you from this place." Amélie felt the darkness receding, the icy grip on her limbs loosening as the sacred energy washed over her. Jacques recoiled, his features twisting in a mask of agony. "Insolent fool!" he spat, his voice layered with the sinister resonance of the entity. "Your pitiful God holds no power over me." The Voodoo Priest lashed out again, his hands weaving a tapestry of dark energy that surged towards Father Dominic. Amélie watched in horror as the priest braced himself, the crucifix held before him like a shield. The two men clashed in a maelstrom of arcane power, the air crackling with the intensity of their confrontation. Amélie felt a surge of desperation, her mind racing as she searched for a way to tip the scales in their favor. Suddenly, a thunderous rumble shook the foundations of the Maison Dupree. Amélie's gaze snapped towards the entrance, where a familiar figure stood, Detective Luc Benoit, his expression a mix of disbelief and grim determination. "What the hell is going on here?" Luc demanded, his hand instinctively reaching for his holstered weapon. Amélie's heart leaped with hope, but she knew that the detective's presence posed a new complication. Luc was a pragmatic, skeptical man who would likely struggle to comprehend the supernatural forces. "Luc, you have to get out of here," she cried, her voice strained with urgency. "This is beyond anything you've ever dealt with before. It's not safe." But the detective's gaze was fixed on the battle before him, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Not a chance," he growled, his hand tightening around the grip of his weapon. "I'm not leaving until I get some damn answers." Amélie opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, a sudden burst of dark energy erupted from Jacques, sending her and Father Dominic reeling. "Fools!" the possessed Voodoo Priest snarled, his eyes burning with unholy fury. "Your pathetic attempts to stop me are futile. The entity's power is beyond your comprehension." With a flick of his wrist, Jacques summoned a horde of voodoo spirits, their skeletal forms coalescing from the shadows. Amélie watched in horror as the spirits surged towards Luc, their glowing red eyes fixed on the detective with predatory intent. "Luc, look out!" she cried, her voice laced with desperation. Luc's eyes widened, and for a moment, Amélie saw the pragmatic veneer crack, a glimmer of fear flickering in his gaze. But then, to her astonishment, he raised his weapon and began to fire, the gunshots echoing through the Maison Dupree. The voodoo spirits recoiled, their unearthly howls piercing the air as Luc's bullets found their marks. Amélie watched, her mouth agape, as the detective stood his ground, his expression hardening with each shot he fired. "Is that the best you've got, you creepy bastards?" Luc growled, his voice laced with a mix of defiance and adrenaline. Jacques let out a roar of frustration, his hands weaving an intricate pattern of arcane symbols. "Foolish mortal," he spat. "Your pathetic weapons hold no power against the Loa." The voodoo spirits surged forward again, their claws slashing and tearing at Luc's flesh. Amélie watched in horror as the detective stumbled, his gun clattering to the floor as he fell to his knees, blood trickling down his face. "Luc!" she cried, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved to rush to his aid, but Father Dominic caught her arm, his grip firm. "Stay back, child," the priest said, his voice low and urgent. "We must focus on disrupting the ritual, or all is lost." Amélie's gaze darted between Luc and the battle between Jacques and Father Dominic, her mind whirling. She couldn't abandon Luc, not when he had risked everything to come to their aid, but she knew the priest was right. If they failed to stop the ritual, the entity's power would only grow until the entire city was consumed. Steeling her resolve, Amélie turned back to Father Dominic, her eyes shining with fierce determination. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. The priest's lips curled into a grim smile, a flicker of pride crossing his features. "Then let us end this madness, once and for all." Together, Amélie and Father Dominic faced the possessed Jacques Dupree, their combined power surging forth in a glorious wave of light and sacred energy. The very foundations of the Maison Dupree trembled under the strain as the fate of the French quarter hung in the balance. The air crackled with a primal, unearthly energy as Amélie and Father Dominic faced off against the possessed Jacques Dupree, the voodoo priest's eyes burning with an unholy power. The very foundations of the Maison Dupree trembled under the strain of the arcane forces unleashed, the shadows seeming to close around them as if the darkness itself were a living, conscious entity. Luc Benoit lay sprawled on the floor, his breath ragged and his body covered in gashes from the voodoo spirit's ruthless assault. Amélie's heart leaped with fear and desperation when she saw the detective fall, his pragmatic facade shattered by the horrific realization that the supernatural was real. But now, with the fate of the entire city hanging in the balance, she knew she had to push aside her concern for Luc and focus on the more pressing threat at hand. "The entity that has claimed Jacques is ancient and powerful," Father Dominic said, his voice low and grave. "We must uncover the truth of its origins and motivations if we hope to defeat it." Amélie nodded, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of information they had gathered. Jacques said it was an evil spirit, drawn to the city, seeking a vessel to enact its dark designs. And my grandmother... Her voice faltered, the weight of her grandmother's disappearance pressing down on her. She must have been close to uncovering something threatening the entity's plans. Father Dominic placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his gaze stern yet understanding. "Then we must retrace your grandmother's steps, child. She may hold the key to unraveling the entity's true nature." Amélie took a steadying breath, her determination hardening. Where do we start? The priest's eyes narrowed, his expression thoughtful. The Maison Dupree, where this all began. Your grandmother was a respected practitioner of the voodoo arts. She must have left some clue, some hint that could guide us. Without another word, Amélie and Father Dominic turned their attention back to Jacques, who had been watching their exchange with a twisted, evil grin. So you think you can uncover the entity's secrets, do you? The possessed voodoo priest drawled, his voice dripping with contempt. Silly mortals, your meddling only serves to amuse me. Father Dominic raised the voodoo talisman, its surface glowing with a warm, comforting light. We will not be deterred, Jacques. The entity's reign of terror ends here. Jacques let out a guttural laugh, his features contorting into a mask of pure spite. You still don't understand, do you? He sneered. The entity's power is beyond your comprehension. It has been waiting for centuries, biding its time, until the moment was right to claim this city as its own. Amélie's brow furrowed, a chill running down her spine. Centuries? What are you talking about? The possessed voodoo priest's lips curled into a cruel smile. The entity is an ancient force, a child, a being of pure darkness that has walked this earth since the dawn of humanity. It has been drawn to the power and mysticism of New Orleans, this city of contrasts, where the veil between the mortal and supernatural worlds is the thinnest. Father Dominic tightened his grip on the crucifix, his knuckles turning white. Then tell us, Jacques, what is the entity's purpose? What does it seek to achieve by possessing you and unleashing its minions upon the city? Jacques' eyes gleamed with unholy hunger. Power, of course. The entity craves power, the adoration and worship of mortals. It seeks to remake this city, to bend the will of its people to its dark designs. And with me as its vessel, it will stop at nothing to achieve its goals. Amélie felt a wave of nausea washes over her, the implications of Jacques' words sinking in. My grandmother must have discovered something about the entity's plans. That's why she disappeared, isn't it? The voodoo priest's expression darkened, and for a fleeting moment, Amélie thought she saw a flicker of remorse in his gaze. Yes, child, he said, his voice laced with a hint of sorrow. Madame Claudette was close to uncovering the truth, to exposing the entity's designs. The entity could not afford to have her interference. Amélie felt her heart constrict, the grief and anger she had been holding at bay threatening to overwhelm her. Then she's gone, isn't she? She whispered, her voice trembling. Jacques nodded solemnly. I am afraid so. The entity demanded her sacrifice, and I could not stop it. Father Dominic stepped forward, his expression grim. Then we must uncover the entity's true nature and weaknesses. Only then can we hope to put an end to its reign of terror and avenge your grandmother's death. Amélie straightened her shoulders, her eyes burning with a renewed determination. Tell us what you know, Jacques. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem. We need to understand the full extent of our threat. The possessed voodoo priest regarded them with a considering gaze, his expression inscrutable. Very well, he said at last. I shall reveal what I know, but be warned. The truth you seek may shatter the very foundations of your understanding. Amélie and Father Dominic steeled themselves, bracing for the revelations to come. As Jacques began to speak, his voice laced with a gravity that sent shivers down their spines. They realized that the battle they had been fighting was merely the first skirmish in a war raging for centuries. It seemed that the entity was no mere spirit or demon, but an ancient primordial force, a being of pure darkness that had existed since the dawn of creation. It had been drawn to the mystical energy of New Orleans. In this city, the veil between the mortal and supernatural realms was thinnest, and it had been biding its time, waiting for the perfect vessel to enact its twisted designs. In his arrogance and hunger for power, Jacques had unwittingly become the entity's conduit, his mind and body corrupted by the evil spirit's influence. And now, with the voodoo priest firmly under its control, the entity was poised to unleash a wave of destruction that would consume the French Quarter and all who called it home. Amélie felt a growing dread and desperation as the grim details unfolded. The entity's power seemed beyond their comprehension, its machinations so deep-rooted and far-reaching that stopping it appeared almost impossible. But she refused to be cowed, her determination only hardening in the face of this terrifying revelation. Turning to Father Dominic, Amélie's expression was one of unwavering resolve. "Then we have no choice but to confront this entity head-on. We can't let it succeed, not when the lives of everyone in this city are at stake." The priest's gaze met hers, a flicker of respect and admiration crossing his features. "You speak with wisdom beyond your years, child," he said, his voice low and grave. "But you must understand. The entity we face is a force of unfathomable darkness, one that has eluded the grasp of even the most powerful practitioners of the occult. Defeating it will require sacrifice, and we may not all survive the ordeal." Amélie's jaw tightened, her eyes shining with a determined gleam. "I know the risks, Father, but I also know that I can't stand by and let this evil consume everything I hold dear. My grandmother's memory and the city I love are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." Father Dominic nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Then let us prepare for the final confrontation, Amélie Rousseau, for the fate of New Orleans hangs in the balance." With a renewed sense of purpose, the two returned to Jacques, ready to uncover the entity's weaknesses and end its reign of terror. The air in the Maison Dupree was tense as Amélie Rousseau and Father Dominic prepared for their final confrontation with the ancient entity that had possessed Jacques Dupree. The Voodoo Priest's revelations had shaken them to their core, exposing the true breadth and depth of the darkness they were up against. Luc Benoit lay nearby, his wounds tended to as best they could manage amid the maelstrom. The detective's eyes were filled with a mixture of disbelief and determination, having witnessed firsthand the horrific power of the voodoo spirits. Though he still struggled to comprehend the supernatural forces at play fully, Amélie knew she could count on him to have their backs when the time came. "The entity's plans are more extensive than we ever imagined," Father Dominic murmured, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It has been orchestrating its rise to power for centuries, waiting for the perfect moment to strike." Amélie nodded grimly, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "And now it's using Jacques to remake this city in its twisted image. We have to stop it, no matter the cost." The priest's gaze met hers, his expression solemn. "You understand the gravity of our task, child. The entity's power is beyond our mortal comprehension. Defeating it will require every ounce of our courage and determination." Amélie took a steadying breath, her resolve hardening. "Then let's not waste any more time. Jacques said the entity is preparing for a final explosive ritual to cement its hold over the city. We have to move now before it's too late." Father Dominic nodded, his fingers tightening around the voodoo talisman. "Very well. I shall confront Jacques again, attempting to break the entity's grip on him. While I do that, I need you to search the Maison Dupree and see if you can uncover any clues that might reveal the ritual's location or the entity's weakness." Amélie's brow furrowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. "But what about Luc? I can't just leave him here, vulnerable to the voodoo spirits." The priest's lips curled into a grim smile. "Do not worry, child. I shall ensure the detective's safety as best I can. Your focus must be finding a way to stop the entity's plans, no matter the cost." Amélie's gaze darted to Luc, her heart clenching at the thought of leaving him in such a precarious position. But she knew that Father Dominic was right. The fate of the entire city hung in the balance, and she had to be willing to make difficult choices if they were to have any chance of prevailing. Squaring her shoulders, Amélie nodded. "All right, Father. I'll search every inch of this place and leave no stone unturned. Just be careful, both of you." "I will, Amélie," Luc said, his voice hoarse but his gaze unwavering. "Go. Do what you need to do. We'll be fine." Amélie felt a surge of gratitude towards the detective, and she offered him a brief, reassuring smile before turning and hurrying more, plunging into the Maison Dupree, her senses on high alert. The air seemed to grow thicker with each step, the shadows deepening and the very walls of the building seeming to press in around her. Amelie could feel the entity's presence, a palpable aura of malevolence that sent shivers down her spine. Undeterred, she pressed on, her gaze sweeping the shelves and nooks, searching for any clue that might reveal the location of the entity's final ritual. The voodoo artifacts and talismans that lined the walls seemed to whisper to her, their arcane symbols and sigils hinting at the dark power that had permeated this place. Suddenly, Amelie's eyes landed on a worn, leather-bound tome, its surface etched with intricate symbols. Her heart leaping with hope, she reached for it, her fingers trembling as she carefully opened the ancient text. The pages were filled with detailed illustrations and cryptic passages, written in a language Amelie recognized as a blend of Creole and a more obscure primal tongue. As she scanned the pages, her brow furrowing in concentration, something caught her eye, a detailed depiction of a ritual circle surrounded by complex sigils and runes. "This is it," Amelie breathed, her pulse quickening. "This is the entity's final ritual. If we can disrupt it, we might have a chance of stopping its plans." Clutching the tome to her chest, Amelie turned and hurried back towards the main chamber, where she could hear the sounds of the confrontation between Father Dominic and the possessed Jacques Dupree. As she burst into the room, she found the two men locked in a vicious battle, their powers clashing in a vortex of light and shadow. Jacques' features were twisted in a mask of pure rage, his hands weaving intricate dark energy patterns that surged toward the priest. "Fools!" the Voodoo Priest roared, his voice layered with the entity's malevolent resonance. "You cannot hope to stop what is to come. The city will be remade, and all who oppose us will be crushed." Father Dominic braced himself, the voodoo talisman held high as he channeled its sacred energy to ward off Jacques' attacks. "We will not yield to your darkness, Jacques," the priest growled, his expression grim but unwavering. "The light of God's love shall prevail over your twisted designs." Amelie knew she had to act and had no time to waste. Stepping forward, she held the ancient tome aloft, her voice ringing out with a clarity that seemed to cut through the din of the battle. "I know the truth, Jacques," she cried, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "I know about the entity's final ritual, which you've been preparing to enact, and I swear to you, we will stop it, no matter the cost." Jacques' expression faltered momentarily, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "Impossible," he hissed, his hands clenching into fists. "The ritual is already in motion. The entity's power will soon be unstoppable." Amelie's gaze narrowed, her voice hardening. "Then we'll just have to see about that, won't we?" Turning to Father Dominic, she quickly explained what she had discovered, her words tumbling out in a rush. The priest's eyes widened with alarm and grim resolve, and he nodded sharply. "Then we have no time to waste," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We must disrupt the ritual before the entity can complete its twisted designs." Despite his wounds, Luke pushed himself to his feet, his expression grim. "Then what are we waiting for?" he growled, his hand instinctively reaching for his holstered weapon. "Let's show this entity what happens when it messes with the wrong city." Amelie felt a surge of gratitude and pride towards the detective, and she knew at that moment that they stood united, ready to face the darkness that threatened to consume them all. Together the trio turned their attention back to Jacques, their gazes filled with a determined, unwavering resolve. The Voodoo Priest's expression twisted with fear and fury, realizing that his carefully laid plans were on the verge of unraveling. "No," he snarled, his voice laced with desperation. "I won't let you interfere. The ritual must be completed." With a violent gesture, Jacques unleashed a torrent of dark energy, the shadows surging like a tidal wave. Amelie, Father Dominic, and Luke braced themselves, their combined efforts working to hold back the onslaught as they made a final, desperate push towards the Voodoo Priest. The air crackled with unbearable tension, the very walls of the Maison Dupree shuddering under the strain of the supernatural forces. Amelie could feel the weight of the ancient tome in her hands, a tangible reminder of their power, the power to disrupt the entity's plans and reclaim the city they loved. As the battle raged on, Amélie knew that the stakes had never been higher. The fate of New Orleans hung in the balance, and they could not afford to fail. She steeled herself with renewed purpose, ready to face the entity's final challenge head-on. The confrontation had reached its climax, and Amélie knew that the moment of truth was at hand. They had come too far to turn back now. The time had come to end the entity's reign of terror, once and for all. The air crackled with an intensity that threatened to rend the fabric of reality itself as Amélie, Father Dominic, and Luc Benoit faced off against the possessed Jacques Dupree. The Voodoo Priest's features were contorted with a mixture of unholy power and frantic desperation, his hands weaving intricate dark energy patterns that surged toward the trio. Amélie gripped the ancient tome tightly. Its worn leather cover was a tangible reminder of the knowledge it contained, the key to disrupting the entity's final, explosive ritual. She knew that their only chance of success lay in breaking Jacques' concentration and severing the connection between the Voodoo Priest and the evil spirit that had claimed him. Father Dominic stood beside her, the voodoo talisman held high, its surface glowing with a warm, comforting light. The priest's brow was furrowed in concentration, his lips moving in a steady, rhythmic chant as he channeled the sacred energy of the artifact to shield them from Jacques' onslaught. Luc Benoit, his face etched with grim determination, stood ready, his weapon drawn and his movements poised and alert. The detective had initially been shaken by the supernatural forces they faced. Still, his pragmatic nature had given way to a steely resolve. He would not let the entity's dark plans come to fruition, not if he had anything to say about it. As the entity-possessed Jacques unleashed another torrent of dark energy, Amélie felt the weight of the ancient tome pressing against her chest, a silent reminder of the power they held. "Now!" she cried, her voice cutting through the din of the battle. "We must disrupt the ritual. Stop him before it's too late." Father Dominic nodded, his expression hardening. "Luc, provide us with cover," he commanded. "Amélie and I will focus on breaking the entity's hold on Jacques." The detective's lips curled into a grim smile. "Consider it done," he growled, his weapon barking to life as he unleashed a hail of bullets toward the Voodoo Priest. Jacques recoiled, his features twisting in a mask of pain and fury as Luc's gunfire found its mark. But even as the detective's barrage pushed him back, the Voodoo Priest continued to weave his dark magic, his voice rising in a frenzied chant. Amélie quickly flipped through the pages of the ancient tome, her eyes scanning the intricate symbols and cryptic passages. "Father, I need you to disrupt his concentration," she called out, her voice laced with urgency. "I've found the ritual circle. If we can break it, we might be able to sever the entity's connection to this realm." Father Dominic nodded, his grip tightening on the voodoo talisman. "I'll do what I can," he said, his voice low and resolute. "But you must be ready, child. The entity's power is beyond mortal comprehension. We may only have one chance to succeed." Amélie took a deep, steadying breath, her heart pounding. "I'm ready," she said, her voice unwavering. "Let's end this." Father Dominic stepped forward with a nod, his chanting rising in volume and intensity. The air crackled with sacred energy, and Amélie watched as the priest's words seemed to take on a tangible, physical form, surging towards Jacques like a wave of pure light. The Voodoo Priest let out a guttural scream as the sacred energy washed over him, his features contorting in agony. Luc took advantage of the momentary distraction, his weapon barking repeatedly, the bullets finding their mark ruthlessly. Amélie seized the opportunity, her fingers flying across the pages of the ancient tome as she desperately searched for the ritual circle's sigils. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as she worked, her mind racing to decipher the cryptic symbols and runes. Finally, her eyes landed on the intricate pattern, and she felt a surge of triumph. "I've got it!" she cried, her voice laced with relief and determination. "Father, keep him distracted. I'm going to disrupt the ritual." Father Dominic nodded, chanting, reaching a crescendo as he poured more of the talisman's sacred energy into his assault on Jacques. The Voodoo Priest let out another agonized howl, his movements growing erratic and disjointed as he struggled to maintain his concentration. Amélie quickly began to trace the sigils on the floor, her fingers moving with a practiced precision born of desperation. She could feel the air around her thickening, the fabric of reality warping and twisting as she worked, the entity's power straining against her efforts. Suddenly, Jacques let out a bone-chilling scream, his body convulsing violently as Father Dominic's assault reached its peak. Amélie seized the moment, her fingers tracing the final sigil, and a surge of sacred energy erupted from the floor, washing over the Voodoo Priest in a blinding wave of light. Jacques howled, his body contorting as the entity's hold on him began to slip. Amélie watched, her heart pounding, as the shadows that had clung to the Voodoo Priest began to peel away, revealing the man beneath, battered, broken, but still fighting to regain control. "No!" The entity's voice echoed through the chamber, its tone laced with a fury that sent shivers down Amélie's spine. "This cannot be." Sensing the shift in the tide of battle, Luke quickly secured Jacques, his weapon trained on the Voodoo Priest's trembling form. "It's over," he growled, his voice unwavering. "The entity's reign of terror is at an end." But even as the detective spoke, the shadows seemed to merge, swirling and twisting into a towering, horrific shape. A being of pure malice, its crimson eyes burning with an unholy hunger. "You fools!" the entity hissed, its voice resonating with a power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Maison Dupree. "You have merely delayed the inevitable. This city, this world, will fall before my might." Father Dominic stepped forward, the voodoo talisman held high. "Your dark designs end here, foul spirit," he declared, his voice ringing with an unwavering authority. "In the name of the Lord, I banish you from this realm." The entity uttered a bone-chilling roar, clawed hands lashing toward the priest. But before the attack could connect, Amélie stepped forward, the ancient tome open in her hands. "No more," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "Your reign of terror ends today." Amélie began to chant with a determined flourish, the words flowing from her lips in a language she did not fully understand. The air crackled with energy, and the entity recoiled, its form wavering and distorted, as if it were being torn apart. Luke and Father Dominic watched in awe as Amélie continued her recitation, her voice rising in volume and intensity. The entity let out a final, agonized scream, its shadowy form dissolving into wisps of swiftly banished darkness, leaving behind only the echoes of its evil presence. Amélie felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her as the last vestiges of the entity's essence faded. She swayed on her feet, her grip on the ancient tome loosening, but Luke was there to steady her, his expression a mix of disbelief and respect. "You did it," the detective murmured, his voice tinged with awe. Amélie managed a weary smile, her gaze shifting to Father Dominic, kneeling by Jacques' side, his hands resting gently on the Voodoo Priest's brow. "How is he?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The priest looked up, his expression somber. "He lives, but the entity's hold has taken a grave toll. It will be a long road to recovery for Jacques and the city." Amélie felt a pang of sorrow, her mind drifting to the fate of her beloved grandmother. "And Madame Claudette?" Father Dominic's gaze darkened, and he shook his head solemnly. "I'm afraid there is nothing we can do for her now. Her sacrifice, though tragic, has allowed us to prevail against the entity's designs." Amélie felt the weight of her grandmother's loss settle heavily upon her, but she knew that Madame Claudette would have wanted her to focus on the future, on rebuilding and healing the city they both loved. "Then let's get to work," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "New Orleans needs us. We can't afford to disappoint it." Luke and Father Dominic nodded in agreement, and together the trio set out to restore order to the French Quarter. Their determination and resilience served as a beacon of hope in the aftermath of the entity's defeat. Though the battle's scars would linger, Amélie knew the city would endure, its indomitable spirit shining through the darkness. As she looked out over the historic streets, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to honor her grandmother's memory by ensuring that the French Quarter would never again fall prey to the forces of evil that had threatened to consume it. The entity's reign of terror was over, and the people of New Orleans were free to reclaim their vibrant, resilient home, a testament to the power of faith, courage, and the unbreakable bond of a community united in the face of adversity.